The client chair had a coffee ring on the arm that hadn't been there on Friday. April's doing, most likely. She'd been spending more time in the office since the warehouse, coming in early, staying late. Running search strings on the 3 remaining placements, like if she stared at the data long enough, it would tell her something new. It hadn't told her anything new in 3 weeks, yet she kept staring anyway. I pulled out the second chair, the one clients usually took, and sat backward in it with my arms over the back. The window behind my desk was doing its usual impression of a painting of the alley, unmoving gray, mildly depressing. Eddie was in the corner chair with his eyes closed. Not sleeping because he doesn't sleep, just resting his expression for a while. April ran me through the parish file situation without looking up from her monitor. The client had been moving it back to active 3 times a week. And April kept putting it in resolved. And she'd reached the end of her patience with the cycle. I told her to let it stay wherever the woman wanted it. She'd worked 3 weeks without the folder existing at all. She could work 3 more with it in the wrong place. April didn't love that answer, but she filed it. Then she looked up, which meant something real was coming. The Pendleton placement crossed into amber this morning. That was new. The Pendleton placement was one of the 3 remaining from Rhodes's notebook, a cost cluster sitting on a family in the northeast corridor of Ashford, 6 months accruing. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it does. We'd been watching it, red adjacent for 2 weeks but stable. How far into amber? I asked. Far enough. She turned the monitor toward me. Numbers, timestamps, the kind of charts that looked like weather reports and functioned as warnings. If it stays on this curve, we've got maybe 8 days before it starts expressing. 8 days was workable, assuming it stayed on the current curve and we didn't hit any complications. Which was the kind of assumption I'd learned to hold loosely. I looked at the numbers for a moment, then looked at Eddie. His eyes were still closed. And the Hargrove placement? Wait and see. Same as yesterday. April pulled the monitor back. The anonymous one is still bothering me. There it was, and I'd been wondering how long before she circled back. She'd done what I asked, hadn't tracked it, hadn't opened a file. But she'd been thinking about it, and the thinking had taken her somewhere she didn't like. Somebody had sent that family-specific guidance, not general guidance, but specific. The kind that required knowing exactly which costs were active, what type, where they were sitting, and what order to address them. The kind of detail that only existed in one place. She asked if I knew who sent it. The way she asked, she already had a hypothesis of her own. I told her I had one too, and told her not yet. Eddie opened his eyes. April held the look for a moment, then turned back to her monitor. She had 17 other things to do, she said. She picked up her coffee mug, found it empty, and set it back down with slightly more force than necessary. Marcus had called that morning, wanted to talk, said it was about a referral. Left the rest of it hanging the way he does when he wants you moving before you've had time to ask questions. I stood up and grabbed my coat. Marcus had 2 operating speeds, ahead of schedule and exactly on time. He never called about a referral unless the referral was standing next to him. April called Pendleton after me as I reached the door. I told her 8 days. And she already knew. I pulled the door open. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's reheated lunch from the 3rd floor. Eddie fell in beside me without being asked, the way he always did. We were halfway to the stairs when my phone rang, showing Marcus's number. Good timing, I said. Young man, Marcus said. I have a colleague of mine in my office who has driven 2 hours to speak with you. I suggest you come down before she decides your time is not worth 2 hours of her own. He told me her name, Renata Sabo, Millhaven, storage practitioner, good reputation, very little patience for people who made her wait. She'd reached out 3 days ago and he'd been vetting before he called. Everything checked. Millhaven was about 60 miles south of Ashford, down the 91 corridor. We'd crossed paths once, me and the Millhaven practitioners, briefly, professionally, both parties pretending the overlap hadn't happened. Renata Sabot wasn't a name I knew, but the name Sabot was. Old Millhaven money, the kind of money that funded storage infrastructure going back to the 60s. I told him 20 minutes, and he said he'd tell her 15 before hanging up. Eddie looked at me and said it out loud, storage practitioner Millhaven, 2 hours, Marcus referral. I told him that was what I'd heard too, and he asked what I was thinking. I'm thinking I need to find my good pen, I said. Because whatever she's carrying, we're going to want a record of it. Marcus's place was on the 3rd floor of a building on Henley Street that had been, at various points in its history, a hat warehouse, a jazz club, and a massage parlor. Now it was just Marcus's building. He owned the whole thing, had for 30 years, and ran what he called an infrastructure consultancy out of the top floor. The front door buzzed me up before I could knock, and it always did. I'd never figured out where the camera was. The office smelled like old paper, good coffee, and something else I'd never been able to name, the faint metallic edge of stored costs. The way a room smells when it's been used for serious work for a long time. Bookshelves on every wall. A desk that had probably weighed 400 pounds even before Marcus filled the drawers. And in the client chair across from it, a woman who looked like she'd been waiting long enough to decide she was done waiting. She stood when I came in. Mid-40s, dark hair shot through with silver. Practical clothes, the kind of practical that comes from years of fieldwork, not from not caring. The kind of handshake that told you she'd been trained by someone who thought handshakes communicated something. We exchanged names, and she said mine first, like she'd already confirmed it. Marcus was behind his desk with his hands folded and the expression he wore when he was pretending not to be the most informed person in the room. He said he'd leave us to it and didn't move. I took the second client chair, the one beside Sabo, and she sat back down. For a moment, neither of us said anything, which is usually how these things start when two practitioners are figuring out how much to trust the other one. Marcus says you do good work, she said finally. Marcus says a lot of things. I left it there. He also says you're not bureau, not affiliated, and not for sale. She looked at me steadily. He said those 3 things like they were a recommendation. They usually are. She nodded. Once, like something had been confirmed. I have a problem. It's not a problem I can solve through normal channels. The normal channels are part of what makes it complicated. And the practitioner I usually bring field problems to is the one directly affected. She paused. Which is why I'm here. Tell me the shape of it, I said. So she did. Her practitioner, a storage specialist named Callum Ward, 53 years old, working out of a facility in South Millhaven for 16 years, had been cleaned out. Not burgled in any conventional sense, with no broken locks, no tripped containment signatures, and nothing that should have registered. 3 months of stored costs were gone, not misplaced, not drifting, but removed surgically. Ward is one of the better storage practitioners in the corridor. Sabo said. His containment work is careful. If someone got past his architecture without triggering a signature, they knew exactly what they were looking for. You said this isn't the first, I said. She looked at me sharply and said she didn't say that. You said it was complicated. And you drove 2 hours instead of calling, which means the shape of the problem is bigger than one practitioner you wanted to handle quietly. I kept my voice neutral. How many? A pause. 3. In 6 weeks. All storage specialists, not active adjusters, in the corridor between Millhaven and the south edge of Ashford. Ward is the most recent. She set a folder on Marcus's desk. The practitioners don't know each other. The facilities have different architectures. There is no obvious thread connecting them except that they're all storage specialists and they're all in the same regional corridor. The costs, where did they go? That's the problem. She met my eyes. They didn't go anywhere. They're not showing up redistributed, not cycling back into the ledger, and not landing on new targets. They are simply gone. She said it like the word was a kind of affront. An adjuster would use them. Someone with skill and access and a reason to take them would use them. But they're not being used. They're being removed. I thought about that for a moment. Someone who wants costs gone, not redirected, but gone. That's my read, Sabo said. Eddie, standing near the bookshelf behind me, said nothing. But I could feel his attention sharpen the way it did when something was actually interesting. I need to walk the sites, I said. 2 of them are accessible. The third is complicated. The building has been sold, and I'm still working on access. I can have it by tomorrow. I told her we'd walk the first 2 today and the third tomorrow, and asked Marcus to pull the storage architecture on both. Marcus smiled, the smile that meant he'd already pulled the storage architecture, and said of course. I picked up the folder from the desk, and Sabo stood and buttoned her coat. For what it was worth, she said. She'd had other options and had chosen this one. I told her I knew. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back once, and said that Marcus spoke highly of my field instincts and that she'd learned to trust Marcus's assessments. She held the door half open, not quite leaving. Don't make me regret that. The door closed behind her. Marcus unfolded his hands and opened the first drawer of his desk. He called her an interesting woman. I told him she was an interesting problem, and he agreed that too. Chapter 2. The first storage site was a building on Caswell Street in the south end of Ashford, a 2-story commercial property that looked like a dental office from the outside and functioned as a dental office on the inside. Because the best cover for anything that didn't want attention was being exactly what it appeared to be. Callum Ward kept his storage space in the basement, behind a converted utility room, behind a containment field that Sabo walked me through in professional shorthand. 3-ring architecture, she said, pulling on latex gloves. Primary field, secondary field, tertiary anchor points at each corner of the room. Ward set this up himself 16 years ago. He's refinished it twice since, but the bones are original. She crouched by the near corner. The anchor point here was untouched. She confirmed all 4 were untouched, then moved to the center of the room. The primary field was intact when I arrived yesterday. No stress fractures, no resonance bleed. If someone took costs out of this space, they did it without touching the walls. She turned to look at me. Which should be impossible. I moved to where she'd been standing, near the center of the room. Closed my eyes for a moment and let my senses do what they did, the particular kind of reading that wasn't quite touch and wasn't quite smell and didn't have a good name. The one the Bureau would have tested me on if I'd ever applied. The one I'd spent 12 years learning to trust. The room felt like a recently emptied closet, not ransacked, just bare. The architecture was intact. Sabo was right about that. The fields were clean. The anchor points were solid. Nothing had been pushed through the walls. But the quality of absence in the center of the room was specific. The way absence gets specific when something has been very deliberately removed from it. I told her they hadn't come in through the architecture, and she said she knew before I opened my eyes. They came in from above, or they mapped the space first. I asked about Ward's inventory notation, whether he kept a documented list of what was stored and where. Sabo paused, just long enough for me to see her mind turning. He uses a paper log, she said carefully. Old system. He converted to digital 3 years ago, but kept the paper as a backup. The paper log is kept off-site. Off-site where, exactly? Another pause. Bureau Archive, Millhaven Sub-Branch. She said it like she didn't enjoy saying it. Standard practitioner documentation for active storage. Required filing. So whoever took these costs had access to Bureau documentation. That's a large population, Sam. She crossed her arms. Internal access levels for Bureau Archive go 6 tiers deep, and every adjuster in the corridor has at least a Tier 2 clearance. Not every adjuster would know what to do with a storage practitioner's inventory notation, I said. Not every adjuster would know how to get in and out of a 3-ring containment architecture without leaving a resonance signature. I looked around the room one more time. This is someone who knows the documentation language and knows storage architecture well enough to move through it cleanly. That's a shorter list. Sabo looked at me and said Bureau Archivist, and I told her that was going to be my next word. We stood in the empty room for a moment. Eddie was somewhere behind me. I could feel the particular weight of his presence, the gravity of him that I'd stopped consciously tracking years ago. The way you stop consciously tracking your own heartbeat. We moved to the second site. The second site was 40 minutes south on the 91. In a converted industrial space outside Millhaven proper that Sabo had been using as a secondary storage facility for overflow work. Not a practitioner's personal space, a shared infrastructure facility. The kind that 6 or 7 regional practitioners paid into collectively. The kind that required shared documentation to function. The architecture here was different. Older, more institutional, the resonance of a space that had been maintained by multiple hands over multiple decades rather than by one practitioner's consistent attention. The absence was the same, clean and deliberate, with nothing in the walls to tell us how. Marcus had called with what he'd found by the time we were walking the second site. I put him on speaker, which meant Sabo heard the conversation too. She'd earned that much. The first site's storage documentation was filed with the Millhaven sub-branch in January, Marcus said. Standard quarterly update. The second site's documentation was filed with the regional archive. That's the Ashford main office. The one on Crescent, in February. Both filings would have been accessible to any bureau employee with archive access in this corridor. A pause. But here's what's interesting, young man. Both documents were accessed under a reading authorization 9 weeks ago. 6 days before the first theft. Reading authorization, I said. Not a practitioner pulling their own records. No, someone pulling records they didn't generate. Another pause. The authorization code belongs to a department that was formally dissolved 8 years ago. The credentials should have been deactivated at dissolution. Sabo, standing beside me, said nothing but her jaw tightened. And which department? I said. Cartographic Services, the Bureau's internal mapping division. They documented placement architecture across the corridor for internal records. Position existed from 1957 through 2017, when digital infrastructure made it redundant. Marcus's voice was measured, careful. The way it got when he was delivering something he'd already thought through to 3 implications. The division had 17 employees at its peak. At dissolution, there were 4. 2 retired to Florida, 1 moved to the Northwest Corridor, and 1 took a medical separation. His name is Owen Kraft, 61 years old, with his last known address on file being a house in the South Corridor, just inside the Ashford boundary. I looked at the empty room, noting the specific quality of a space that had been known, mapped, and then emptied. He didn't take anything himself, I said. He can't, because he was a cartographer, not a practitioner. He mapped storage architecture and doesn't have the hands to move costs. No. Marcus agreed. But he knows exactly where everything is. And if he found someone who did have the hands, he hired the workout. I thought about it. The hired practitioner cleared out once it got complicated, and Owen Kraft is sitting alone with a map he spent 8 years drawing, a reason he spent 8 years building toward, and nothing left to do with it. Sabo looked at me. You got that from a name and a department. Marcus got me to the name. I just know what a man with 8 years invested in a project looks like when the project ends wrong. I picked up my phone. Can you get me the address? Already sent, Marcus said. Chapter 3. Between the second site and the South Corridor. There's a stretch of 91 where the city falls away, and you get about 8 miles of scrub pine and old industrial overgrowth before the suburban grid starts again. I drove it doing 5 over the limit, which was my usual, with the radio on something that wasn't saying anything important. Eddie was in the passenger seat. He'd been quiet through both site visits, not absent, just watching. The way he watched when he was processing rather than commenting. The sun was low enough that it came through the windshield at the specific angle that would have made him squint when he was alive. He didn't squint now. He just let the light move through the space where he sat. Anonymous tip, he said, after about 4 miles. I asked if that was where we were starting, and he said I'd been not starting it for 6 hours. He wasn't wrong. The anonymous tip, the resolved placement, the one that had been cleanly addressed before our team could reach it, with specific guidance that required knowing exactly what was in Rhodes's notebook, had been sitting in the back of my mind since April mentioned it that morning. Sitting there with its hands folded, being patient. I said April thought I knew who did it, and Eddie told me April was right. I said April didn't have the full picture. But he said no. She had the instinct. And that was the more dangerous thing. He turned to look at the road, his profile in the afternoon light, looking almost entirely real, almost. You know it's an opening move. Someone holding 11 case files, letting one go as a demonstration. Not to clear the case, to show you they can. He paused. To show you they're choosing when to. I told him I'd been thinking about it the same way. He asked what I was going to do about it. And I took the southbound exit, toward the city's lower shoulder. And I think there's a conversation I'm going to have that I'm not going to enjoy. Eddie made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You're describing about 60% of your conversations. I told him this one was different, and he said he knew while looking at the road. I know what it is. We drove for a while without talking. The city started filling in around the highway, gas stations, storage facilities. The kind of strip development that happens when nobody's watching. The radio found a country station and I left it there, which meant I was in a particular kind of mood. Eddie didn't comment on the country. After a while, he said the radio had been quiet. 2 weeks, I told him, since the drive back from Dunmore. Ordinary static once, then nothing, and the frequency had been quiet. He didn't answer that. We drove another 1/4 mile of scrub pine and old chain link. Then he said it wasn't the same as it being gone. No, I agreed. It's not. The radio played something about a woman and a truck and a very specific sense of loss. Neither of us commented on that either. Owen Craft's house was coming up in 7 minutes according to the navigation. I turned down the radio but didn't turn it off. I started working through it out loud, if she had the notebook, and she was managing it as a controlled release. Then the remaining cases were hers to dispense unless I made an arrangement, which was exactly what she wanted me to think. Eddie confirmed each piece as I laid it down, not editorializing, just confirming, and then told me I was going to think about whether it was also correct. I didn't answer that because he was right, and we both knew it. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do in a conversation is not fill the space that's already been filled. Owen Craft's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood that had probably been new construction in the mid-90s and had settled into that particular flavor of ordinary since then. 2-car garages, basketball hoops. Mature trees that the original buyers had planted as saplings. His house was the second from the end, with beige siding, dark shutters, and a careful lawn. Nothing that would make you look twice. I parked. Eddie said he didn't want to wait outside when I offered. I told him it was a courtesy. He said he knew, and still didn't want to wait outside. We went to the door. Chapter 4. Owen Craft opened the door on the second knock, like he'd been expecting something, just not me specifically. He was 61, medium height, The kind of build that had been broader 20 years ago. Gray at the temples, reading glasses pushed up into his hair. He had the look of someone who'd spent 30-plus years working in institutional spaces, a particular way of holding himself that said fluorescent lighting and filing systems and the particular exhaustion of people who know where everything is. He looked at me, then past me at the empty porch, and finally back at me. "Mr. Vance," he said. He said it like a fact he'd assembled from available evidence rather than something I'd told him. That was interesting. He said he knew my name, knew I wasn't bureau, and stepped back to let me in. The inside of the house looked like the outside, careful, neutral, deeply lived in. A lot of paper. Not messy, just present stacks on the coffee table. Organized stacks on the shelves by the stairs. A long folding table along one wall covered in maps. Actual paper maps, the kind that required printing in sections and assembling by hand. My eyes went to the maps before I could stop them. Kraft offered coffee and went to get it. I said sure. I'd been driving for 3 hours and my coffee from that morning was a distant memory. He came back with 2 mugs, sat in the armchair across the coffee table, and I took the couch. Eddie moved to stand by the map table and looked at it like he was reading a menu. "I knew someone was coming," Kraft said. "I didn't know who. I thought bureau, maybe. But the bureau would have sent more people and they wouldn't have knocked." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "How'd you find me?" "Archive pull," I said. "Dissolved department. Active credentials. You covered your tracks carefully. You just couldn't scrub everything from the system at once without flagging it." He nodded slowly and set his mug down. "I was careful." "You were very careful. The containment work especially, walking through a 3-ring architecture without leaving resonant signature, takes someone who knows the interior geography at a level that most active adjusters don't bother to develop. You must have documented hundreds of these spaces." "Closer to 300, he said, without particular pride. Cartographic services ran from 1957 through 2017. I was the last full-time employee. I mapped the entire Northeast Corridor twice over in my 22 years. Every active storage space, every placement architecture, every containment field." He looked down at his mug. "I know where everything is. I knew where everything was going to be." I asked about the hired practitioner, and his jaw tightened. "She wasn't connected to this anymore," he said. "She'd stopped when it got complicated, and he hadn't been willing to compel her to continue." I told him I wasn't there to build a case against her. He asked why I was there. I looked at him, and he looked back. He was tired in a way that came through in the way he held the mug, both hands slightly forward. The weight of someone who had been running a significant amount of effort for a very long time and had run out of road. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. The silence that followed was the kind that does some of the heaviest lifting in a conversation. "My brother," he said finally. "Callum Ward is one of the practitioners I took from. The costs in his storage, some of them were his. Ward's a good practitioner and a decent man, and he doesn't know my brother's name. He just took on storage work that came to him through the regional exchange and didn't ask whose it was originally." He paused. "I don't blame him." "Tell me about the cost," I said. He told me. 22 years ago. A placement, legitimate, documented, sanctioned by the Bureau's Active Case Division. His brother Gabriel had been the target. Not through malice, not through the kind of calculated targeting that Rhodes had run. Through bureaucratic negligence, a practitioner who needed to place a cost. A target who happened to fit the profile. A case officer who signed off without looking hard enough. The cost was a health cluster. The cumulative kind, the slow kind, the kind that settles into the body over time and doesn't announce itself with a diagnosis because there's nothing on a scan that would explain what a scan can't see. Gabriel Kraft, 48 years old, had been deteriorating for 22 years. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but just consistently, slowly. in the specific way that health costs express when they've been sitting long enough to become part of the body's baseline. The practitioner who placed it, I said. Died 6 years ago. Owen said it flat, like a door closing. Heart attack. Natural. I verified it 3 separate ways, and it wasn't retaliation. It was just a man with poor cardiac health dying at 67. He set his mug down, which meant the official clearance channel closed. The case is 6 years cold. The practitioner is gone. The case officer retired in 2019, and the paper trail is complete and useless. I told him there was no authorized path to clear it. He said there hadn't been for 6 years, and he looked up at me. So I started drawing a different kind of map. Eddie, by the map table, had stopped pretending to look at the maps. He was looking at Owen Kraft with an expression I didn't see on him often. Not sympathy exactly, but more like recognition. I said 8 years. He said he'd retired medically in 2017, his knees, and almost smiled. Gave him something to do with his time. I asked why the hired practitioner had stopped at Ward's facility. She'd run into a cost cluster from the mid-90s that she didn't feel comfortable moving without documentation she didn't have, he said. He couldn't get the documentation fast enough, so she'd decided the risk wasn't worth it, and withdrawn. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who had been through worse things and survived them by staying level. I can't move costs myself. I was a cartographer, so I know where the roads are, but I don't have a vehicle. I sat with that for a moment. The costs from Ward's facility and the 2 others, where are they now? Secure. I stored them myself in a mapped space I built using architecture I documented 22 years ago. It's stable and it's not going anywhere. He looked at me steadily. I can't move them to Gabriel without a practitioner's hands. But I wasn't going to leave them where they were. I pulled them so they couldn't be used for anything else while I was figuring out the next step. I thought about the 3 practitioners who'd had their storage emptied. Their stored costs pulled. Yes, but pulled carefully, stored elsewhere. Not scattered or dispersed or fed into anything worse. Owen Kraft had done the work of an adjuster without the capacity of one, which meant he'd done it the slow, painstaking, knowledge-only way. I'll tell you what I can and can't do, I said. He waited. I can't clear Gabriel's cost myself. It's a structured placement from a bureau active case file. I don't have the credentials to close it officially. And even if I did, a health cluster that's been sitting for 22 years needs a practitioner with more experience in long-term placement work than I've got. I watched his face carefully. But I know someone who works cold case placements. Old costs, dead practitioners, closed channels. She works independent of the bureau, which means she doesn't need the official clearance path. I leaned forward slightly. She's not cheap and she's not fast, but she's real. Owen Kraft looked at me for a long time. Is this the part where you tell me you'll make the referral if I cooperate, he said. Not a question. Just a man who'd been around institutional processes long enough to know when they were happening to him. No, I said. The referral is real regardless of what happens with Renata Sabo and the storage practitioners you took from. I'm giving it to you because your brother is sick, and there might be a path for him and you should have it. I sat back. What happens with the practitioners is a separate conversation, and I'm going to be honest with you. The costs you took from them have to go back, or you have to make it right with them directly. Ward especially. He's been sitting on a 3-month hold in his storage, and he deserves to know why. He asked, after a long pause, whether I'd facilitate that conversation. That's what I said. I meant it the way I said it, not as a favor, not as leverage. Just as a fact about what I was willing to do. He picked up his mug again, both hands, the weight of someone who had been running for 8 years and had just heard the particular sound a door makes when it opens instead of closing. Okay, he said. It wasn't a surrender. It was just a decision. Chapter 5. The drive back was the long way, up through the industrial stretch and onto Crescent before cutting back to the office. The low-pressure system that had been threatening since morning had finally made up its mind. And a thin rain was coming down. The kind that wasn't quite cold enough to be satisfying. I called Sabo from the car. Owen Kraft, I said. 61, former bureau cartographer, medical retirement 2017. Knows the storage architecture in the Northeast Corridor better than anyone alive because he spent 22 years drawing it. I gave her the shape without the details that weren't mine to share. The hired hand is gone. He's alone. He has the costs he took from your 3 practitioners stored in a stable space he built himself. He's not a bad man, Renata. He's a man with a brother and a 22-year problem and a very specific skill set that he used in the most careful way he knew how. Silence on her end, and she said I wasn't going to report him. I asked her to who, then a pause. Fair enough. Her voice shifted back to the practical register. The one that meant she'd filed the other part away for later. The costs? What's his plan for them? He's open to making it right with the practitioners, Ward especially. I told him I'd be there for the conversation. I'll contact Ward, she said. Give me 2 days. She asked about the referral, cold case placement work. Was it real or a courtesy? I told her it was real. The person I had in mind had cleared placements going back to the 40s, long-term, complex, abandoned channel work. Independent of the Bureau. I'd give her the contact separately to pass to Kraft directly. It was his brother, not her case. Sam. Her voice had shifted, slightly. The efficiency still there, but something underneath it. Why did you handle this the way you did? You could have brought this to Sabo. Filed a report with the regional exchange. Let it process through the normal channels. The normal channels would have arrested a 61-year-old retired archivist with bad knees and a sick brother, I said. And it wouldn't have helped Gabriel Kraft. A pause. Yeah, she said. Okay. The line dropped, and I handed the phone to the cup holder. Eddie had been quiet through the call. He was watching the rain now. Or watching the space where rain was. It's hard to tell with him, whether he registers weather as experience or just as information. After a while he said, You think she's going to keep it off the official record? I think she came to me instead of the regional exchange for a reason, I said. I think she drove 2 hours because Marcus vouched, and she wanted a solution that didn't require a practitioner getting brought in on theft charges. Professionally convenient, Eddie said. Most things are, when the right 2 people decide they want the same outcome. I took the Crescent Street turn. The office building was 3 blocks ahead. She's not a friend. Eddie agreed. I told him she might be reliable and that there was a difference. He didn't disagree with that. The office was dark except for April's desk lamp when I got back. April herself was still there. It was nearly 8 o'clock, which meant she'd been there for 14 hours. Which was not unusual for April in a heavy week, and was something I'd stopped commenting on because she'd started pointing out that I did the same thing, and then we both had to sit with that. She looked up when I came in. I gave her the shape of it. We knew who it was. It was going to get sorted. She gave me the Pendleton update in return. Still amber, monitoring flag set, time to spare. Derek had checked in with nothing to report, which she'd started reading as code for something. I'd started reading it the same way. She said Marcus had called about an hour ago and had something for me. But he would call back tonight. Then she said my name the way she says it when she's been waiting to say something else. The anonymous tip. I sat down, picked up a pen, and put it down. I told her there was a possibility, and I said it carefully. Because it was still a possibility and I wasn't ready to make it more than that someone with access to Rhodes's notebook had been managing the remaining placements on their own timetable. Not randomly, but deliberately. One at a time. In a controlled sequence. Using case data specific enough to suggest they had the full files. April went very still. That's Leland, she said. I said it was a hypothesis. She said it was Leland flat this time, and that I'd known since that morning. I told her I'd had a hypothesis since that morning. She leaned forward and asked what it meant for the remaining 10 cases if Leland was deciding when to move them. I told her it meant Leland was deciding, and that Leland wanted us to know she was deciding. That was the point. April sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. When she looked back down, her expression was the careful kind that meant she was about to say something she'd already edited twice. Are you going to talk to her? I think she's going to make sure I don't have to choose about it. What does that mean? April asked. I didn't answer that because the answer was the shape of what I'd been sitting with all day, and saying it out loud wouldn't change its shape. Just make it official. April looked at me for a long moment, then stood up and started packing up her bag. She said she was going home, going to sleep, and going to not think about Leland until tomorrow. She suggested I do the same. Yeah, I said, which was not the same as agreeing to do it. She left, and the door clicked. The building went quiet in the way it does after 10 o'clock on a weeknight, the heat ticking in the pipes, the faint traffic from Crescent, the silence of a floor that was built for more tenants than it currently had. Eddie settled into the corner chair across from my desk. His jacket had a crease where it pressed against the arm. The specific crease of a specific garment in a specific position. I'd been not looking at that crease for 3 weeks, and I kept not looking at it now. My phone rang. Marcus. Young man, Marcus said. I've been looking at the operational signature from the anonymous tip. And what did you find? I said. The timing and the method of delivery, specific guidance, sourced through a channel that shouldn't exist, addressed to the family directly rather than through any official bureau mechanism. He was quiet for a moment. It's elegant, not efficient. Elegant. Which is a distinction that matters, because efficiency would have been anonymous bureau contact. Elegance is a demonstration. You're reading it as an introduction. I'm reading it as the first line of a letter, Marcus said. Someone is telling you that they have the list, that they can manage it, and that they are choosing when to do so. That is not a threat, young man. That's an offer. A pause, a very specific kind of offer, from a very specific kind of person. Leland. A long pause. I'll tell you what I know and you can draw the line yourself. The operational signature matches the profile of a high-level bureau facilitator working independently of standard channels. The kind of person who has access to senior case data across multiple corridors, but no official current bureau role. Another pause. The kind of person who has been watching you for longer than you knew, and has recently recalculated the value of keeping you functional versus the value of watching what you do next. That's Leland, I said. That's a profile that fits Leland, Marcus said carefully. I'm not in the business of naming names without more than a profile. Fair enough, I said. What are you going to do about it? I looked at Eddie, and Eddie looked at me. Neither of us said anything out loud for a moment, which wasn't the same as not having a conversation. I don't know yet, I said. That's honest. A pause. Get some sleep, young man. The shape of things will still be there in the morning. It always is, I said. He hung up, and I set the phone down. Eddie said I knew what I was going to do. I told him I knew what I was probably going to do. He said that was the same thing. No, I said. It's not the same thing. I picked up a pen, turned it over, and put it down. Knowing what you're going to do because the math says it's the only available option, and knowing what you're going to do because you've decided, those are different things. Eddie looked at me with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite the lack of it. Okay, he said. Outside, the rain had gone from thin to steady, and the heat ticked in the pipes. The building settled around us with the specific weight of a building that had been through a lot and expected to go through more. Chapter 6. The envelope appeared at 10:15. I heard it, the whisper of something sliding under the door, the soft, specific sound of paper against floor. I was at my desk, and Eddie's head came up. I didn't move immediately. I've been in this business long enough to know that things slide under doors at 10:15 on a Tuesday night for a limited range of reasons, and most of them require a moment before you deal with them. Then I crossed the room and picked it up. Plain envelope, no markings on the outside. The paper was heavier than average, good stock. The kind someone buys in quantity because they use envelopes seriously. Inside was a single folded sheet and a case file, photocopied, the original's handwriting rendered in gray-black ink. I recognized the handwriting. Rhodes. The case file was the Hargrove placement, one of the 3 remaining from the notebook. The one we'd been calling the dangerous one because the cost cluster was the most volatile of the active 3. The kind that had the potential to express badly if it went unstabilized much longer. 8 months of accrued medical costs sitting on a man named Gerald Hargrove, who didn't know he was a target and had been having a hard time keeping weight on since February. The folded sheet had 3 words on it. 3 days. No signature, no other identifying information. Just the handwriting. Not Rhodes's this time. A different hand entirely, and the number and the specific placement file that told me everything I needed to know about who'd put it there and what they wanted me to understand. I stood with it in my hand for a moment and read it twice. Then I folded the sheet back into the envelope, set it on the desk, and put the case file down next to it. Eddie from the chair said, "Well." I told him, "Yeah." And there wasn't a lot else to say about it. He said 3 days was a deadline. I sat down and told him it was also a timeline for the placement. If Hargrove's costs weren't addressed in 3 days, they were going to start expressing. And whoever sent this was working from the same notebook data I had. It wasn't arbitrary. "So you go to Hargrove," Eddie said. So I go to Hargrove. I picked up the case file and started reading. And the person who sent this knows I'm going to go to Hargrove, because there's no other option, and going to Hargrove means accepting the terms of the deal they're not quite asking for yet. Eddie was quiet for a moment, then said, "She's been waiting a while to do this." "Probably since the day after the warehouse." I turned a page. "Maybe before. She watched you spend 3 weeks working through the Rhodes cases methodically. She let you get through 8 of 11. She let you almost believe you had a handle on it." He paused. "Then she slid 2 cases under the door, one resolved, one handed to you on a timeline. Just so you know the distance between what you can do alone and what she can do when she decides to. That's about the size of it," I said. I read through the Hargrove case file. The details were clean, professionally assembled. The kind of documentation Rhodes had built his reputation on: precise, thorough, completely damning and completely useless to anyone who wasn't an adjuster. The rain was harder now. I could hear it against the single window, the particular drum and drip of a steady October rain on glass that had been set in its frame slightly wrong, creating a gap at the upper corner where the sound came through cleaner than it should. I said Eddie's name. He said, where would he go? Not a question, just a fact about his situation. I told him if I went to this meeting, if there was a meeting, I needed him to not editorialize at the time. He asked what time. I told him the time when she said something he'd want to respond to. A pause. Then, define editorialize. He said it like it was a reasonable question. You know what I mean, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to sit in the back seat while the woman who engineered my death explains the terms of a deal she's offering you because she thinks you're useful. His voice was flat. I'm not able to promise anything about my face. You can control your face when you want to, I said. Occasionally, he said, and then fell quiet again. Another pause. I'll try. That was probably the best I was going to get. I set the case file down and stared at the ceiling for a moment. The particular texture of plaster that had been painted and repainted many times over 60 years and had developed a topography of its own because of it. Then the radio crackled. Not the office radio. I don't keep a radio in the office. The sound came from the portable on the shelf by the window, the one I kept charged out of habit. It had been sitting silent for 3 weeks. Not music. Not static. A frequency. The same frequency from the warehouse. The one we'd first caught in the weeks before everything fell apart. Low, thin, a drone that sat just under the range where you'd call it a tone and just above the range where you'd call it silence. The kind of sound that occupied a specific register and stayed there without fluctuating, without changing pitch. It had come back. Eddie's head came up. The drone sat in the air of the office for 4, 5, 6 seconds. Long enough to be unmistakable and long enough for me to know it wasn't interference. Then it stopped, and the radio hissed once, briefly, and went quiet. Eddie and I looked at each other across the office. Eddie said it had come back, and I told him I heard, and left it there. He didn't say anything after that, and neither did I. We didn't need to. We'd both heard it in the warehouse the first time. Both heard what it wasn't and what it was. And we'd spent 3 weeks not talking about what it meant that it hadn't come back yet. And now it had. And the talking about it didn't seem to change the fact of it. I picked up the Hargrove case file. 3 days, a placement going critical. An offer I hadn't asked for and didn't have a good reason to refuse. And a drone in the radio receiver that had returned after 3 weeks of silence, quiet and patient as a stone in water. I started reading from the beginning.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.